Hey everyone, this is Brian F. and this is another edition of Inside the Studio. And today I want to talk a little bit about another experience I had. Actually, it's with the band Sacrament of Impurity again, because this time they actually asked me to do a one-track session with them that they were going to put on a compilation album that's to be released later this year. And they wanted to do something a little different. Instead of being in my studio here, they asked if for this session that I can just come to their rehearsal space. And the rehearsal space really isn't all that large. It's actually maybe only 10 by 20 feet, if even that. And it's actually in a loft up above a business. And the way it's set up is the drummer sits back in the corner and the guitar player will set up on the other end of the room and do their thing. But what they wanted to do is they wanted to actually try to set up there, but then the drummer had asked for this time around, instead of using a full complement of mics that I did on their last recording, this time he wanted to see what it would be like, what kind of sound we can get by just using two large diaphragm condensers for overheads, and then maybe a mic at the kick and a mic at the snare. This is a technique I've never done before, because in my situation in the past, using limited microphones has not revealed the best results because of all the unwanted artifacts, the unwanted sound and stuff that had come through the mics because of where I had to place them in order to cover the entire drum kit. But what this method is, it's actually a variation, if not the actual method, of the Glyn Johns technique. And if you aren't sure what the Glyn Johns technique is, look it up. There's a shitload of information out on YouTube and all over the web about it that you can learn about. But basically, what he did, it's the setup he used for Led Zeppelin and a number of other bands throughout the years. You place a condenser maybe about 4 feet above the snare, directly above the snare. And then you listen to it while the drummer's playing, and you have it adjusted where it's pitched at, where it's looking at the kit, until you get a nice balance of the entire kit. After that, just take a simple measurement. In the case I did, was just used an extra guitar cord. Set it on the snare, measured up to the mic, and then we pulled it over to the side, and we stuck another condenser up there, just above the cymbals and the floor toms. And I was within 2 inches, I think it was, of the actual cable. I couldn't get the mic any closer than that because of how the cymbals were set up for the drum kit. But the idea is to get the two mics equal distance away from the snare so that the snare itself is in phase through each mic. So it sounds like a mono source. Basically, that's how we set it up. We set it up in the room, and then we actually took the guitar cabs and we placed them outside in their living quarters with the door shut a bit, and we close mic those with just a single dynamic microphone this time instead of using condensers and dynamics. There's a few people on the recording forums that I'm part of, the AW4416 forum and some of the other stuff, that were interested in knowing just how the technique turned out. So the results were actually pretty surprising. Overall, the two large diaphragm condensers created a pretty good stereo image of the kit. Even though we weren't in the best of conditions for recording, the best rooms or whatnot, we still got a pretty good sound. Even the snare, with a heavy pan on one mic to the left and the same for the other one on the right, even the snare came out sounding pretty dead center. But there was a little bit of difference on how the snare sounded on one channel. I think it was just a little darker on one side. And it might have just been the angle of the mic as in relation to the snare. Even though the distance was the same, where it was located at an angle towards the snare, it just gave it a slightly different tone. Then again, for all I know, it could have been the mic itself. Even though it was the same model of microphone, it could have just had a slightly different sound because of some design flaw inside or something. At which point, if we were really interested, we would correct that with a little bit of EQ on the input system. Or, we could do it again on the actual mix through on the monitoring system. I didn't really think it was necessary though, because it was a pretty damn good sound, and yet we still had the kick mic and the snare mic themselves that we could work with. So the idea was is I was going to try to get a good sound, like a tighter sound out of the snare, make it not so booming, just to see if I could try and do it. But I didn't have really much success there, simply because the snare itself did not produce those frequencies. And because in this particular setup, we couldn't really try to like gate off the microphones. With this few mics, it was important to capture the overheads as best as possible. Since the overheads were used to pick up not only the cymbals and the hi-hat this time, but they were also used to pick up the toms, you couldn't try to get rid of the drums in the overheads, so that you can then more effectively gate and focus directly in on each individual drum on its own individual mic. Everything had to be mixed together as a complete kit. If we tried to mix the snare as if only the snare existed and then add in the rest of the kit, you're going to still hear the snare coming in through the overheads, you're going to hear the kick come into the overheads, and the two signals, the two frequencies will just play off of each other and not create a very good tone. You'll either get too much bass, or you get too much high end, or too much mud. So you have to actually compensate for that. And in this kind of a setting, that means you have to mix it with everything live and open. All the mics have to be open. No gates, no nothing. I tried mixing it, and what ended up happening is that I was able to get a pretty good sound with a more lively snare and an okay kick, but ultimately they sounded like they were far back in the mix. But at the same time, I couldn't bring them forward to stronger levels without seriously affecting the headroom I had here in the stereo master bus. So right now, I want to just kind of show you the effects that all that had, what it sounded like, and what I was working with. All right, here is the track data for this new track that we used, and I haven't labeled anything yet because at the time for me it wasn't really necessary. But what we're going to do right now is we're going to try to isolate just the drum tracks so that you can hear what they sound like. All right, so what we got is channels 1 and 2, track 1 and 2. These are the overheads, and these are what has been placed in the method that Glyn Johns made famous. As you can see, they both run the same EQ curve. And they both have the same compression setting. But right now, I want to set it up so that you guys can hear the raw sound coming through the two large diaphragm condensers and nothing else. Let's go ahead and turn off the compressor on the stereo channel as well. Alright, let's go ahead and start it back up. All right. Well, that sound, you could tell it was just two mics. It didn't sound that great or whatever. And it doesn't really fit with the style of music, but it might work out just great if it was in a better room and the music was, say, maybe more jazz oriented, maybe some older rock, because we haven't yet added EQ. We haven't yet added any kind of compression. This is just the two overhead mics picking up the whole kit with extreme panning and left and right. And as you can hear, there was no real phasing issues. You might have heard the snare coming out of one side a little louder than the other. Overall, though, for like where the toms came in and the cymbals and the hi-hats, they had great sound for the most part, and actually had great separation. And even in that room, backed up and against the corner, it came through pretty damn good. So I was really surprised about how well it worked. All right, so we're just going to select the two overhead channels here, and we're going to go to EQ, and this is the curve I put in. I cut out the mid-range, actually not really even the mid-range. I cut it out, centered around 707 hertz, and cut out quite a bit, and then boosted the low end a little bit. And then I gave it a little bit of boost on the 11.3K for the high end. And overall, this is what the sound turned into. Let's turn them both on, and here we go. Get it running. So I set the EQ in a manner to cut out quite a bit at the 7 hertz range. I cut out a 12 dB or over, but it gave the kit a fuller sound. The toms came through stronger, the cymbals were nice and bright and nice separation, but it did kind of cut out the kick and the snare some. They weren't anywhere quite as loud. So the next step was, well, what happens if I put a compressor on it, bring it all down? Will that help the snare and the kick come out? And I'll show you what I found out. Alright, so we're turning the compressors on just the overhead channels. And let's just turn them on. We don't need to select anything. They're already set up that way. Channel 2. Alrighty. Now let's see what kind of a difference that made to the sound. Putting that mild of a compressor on it actually did seem to bring out the snare and the kick a little bit more, but I was noticing it was actually affecting the cymbals a lot more than anything else, and maybe the toms as well, but mostly the cymbals. And I didn't want to do much more with the cymbals. I liked where they were at. I liked the sound they had. So now it was time, I figured, throw in the snare mic and the snare track and the kick track and blend them in and see what happens. But overall, I didn't quite like how it sounded. I could still hear the reverberance, the difference between the two channels of the overheads, and for both the kick and the snare, even though I had the regular snare track and the mono snare track and the mono kick track playing with them. And I didn't like that. I didn't like hearing the hit in the center here, while the resonance and reverberation from just the snare themselves were out here, or just the kick itself were out here. So I wasn't really sure what to do. I mixed it that way. I felt like this might be all I can do with this technique based on the room we were in. Let's just see how it plays out and run with it. Try different EQ settings, try different dynamic settings, and see what happens. But this really just may be it. Well, check it out. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is how if I remember right, this is how I first mixed the track with all the instruments in. I'll play a little bit of it for you. I don't know if you were able to hear all the little things that I could hear, but obviously I ended up bringing in the snare channel and making it quite mid-range and putting compression on it and whatnot to hopefully kind of make it break through the rest of the sound of the drums and to break through the rest of the music, how I had it set out. But I didn't like how it sat there. It just seemed a little unnatural. But obviously, I was able to get a different tone for the snare with just some EQing and compression techniques than what it naturally had. But now the other thing that stuck out to me that I didn't like is I set up the kick mic so that it'd get more click, not necessarily the high frequency end, but kind of the mid-rangey end, the 1 kilohertz to 2 kilohertz range for the attack. And then gave it some bottom end as well. But if you didn't notice, I can explain to you. Out of the left channel, there seemed to be just more boom on the left side than on the right side, and that's because of how everything was being affected with the overheads being open like they were, the amount of bass that was coming through both mics, and how they were picking up in the room, and then blending with the single mic in behind the kick drum. It just didn't quite work out right. I guess back in the olden days, it would be okay. It'd be like, well, this is what we got and this is what we can do, but I didn't think that it was where it needed to be. There had to have been something else. So I tried a few more mixes. I tried a few more techniques. And it wasn't until the very end that I stumbled onto something that I'll show you a little bit later. But let's go ahead and go through the other mixes first and see how they ended up sounding, shall we? Okay, this is the second mix through I tried. Making a few changes on the drums. Not much. As you can see on the, I think the snare here, I've rolled off a low pass filter at 9.51 kilohertz. But I just boosted the shit out of the kick. Now overall, I was pretty happy with how the drums sounded in that mix. I did have to make some changes to where the snare itself wasn't so strong, and I had made a little changes to the kick and how the levels were set and how the compression was set. But the kick sounded a little more centered and the snare sounded a little more centered. However, it did come across in a manner that reminded me of some mixes from late 70s. Maybe there's still something more I could do. What could I do? I wasn't sure. And so it just became a matter of playing around. Ultimately, what it came down to was just playing around with the phasing of the snare channel and the kick channel. I changed it so that both the snare and the kick channel got slightly different EQ curves, different dynamics settings, and reversed the phasing on it. And it made a hell of a difference compared to before. So all they are is they're out of phase 180 degrees from where the overhead mics are set. I'll show you the difference it makes. Let's get the track started. I wonder if we can hear the difference in just the drums itself without the music playing. Now we're able to hear the difference in the kick. This is the kick with the phase reversed 180 degrees from everything else. And this is the kick with the phasing back to normal settings instead of reverse settings. Makes a hell of a difference. It's so much heavier, fuller, and fatter with the phasing reversed as it was when it was normal. Let's do the same thing to the snare. So just by inverting the phase of the kick mic and the snare mic made a hell of a fucking difference. It made the things sound fatter and fuller with more punch, more power, but not only that, it actually made the sound become more centered in the entire mix. You could see when you were watching the screen as I switched the phasing of the channel from normal to reverse and back and forth, how the sound itself of that particular channel would not only become less powerful in when it was set to normal setting, but it would sound like it spread in the in your left and right channels, as opposed to how it was when the phasing was reversed. And it worked that way for both the snare and the kick channel. You could hear it going out, coming in, going out, coming in. And it sounded a hell of a lot better, so much better, with the phasing of those two channels set to reverse in conjunction with the overheads left at normal, that there was just no way around it. This was the way to do it. The Glyn Johns technique works, and it works very well. And it can be used for metal music, it can be used for extreme metal music, and it can be used in situations that are less favorable for your acoustic conditions than even the room I'm in now. You can use the Glyn Johns technique to still get a fucking great sound out of your kit. It all really just comes down to your dynamics processing, your EQing, and having the ability to affect the phase a little bit here or there. It'll all sit really nicely in the mix together. Now, that being said, some people will say, well, what about the phasing issue in the mics themselves? If you don't get them just the perfect distance from your centered object, in this case the snare, if they're not both perfectly equal, there's going to be some phase, because, well, it's not theory anymore. It is a fact that if this side is just a hair farther than this side, it'll take sound that just that much longer to reach, as opposed how long it takes to reach this side. And so, in essence, there is going to be a bit of a phasing issue there, but as I was able to show in this demonstration, you can't really hear anything at all. It still sounds pretty fucking centered. In the case of anybody who's got a DAW system, a modern DAW system, you do have the ability to set a 360-degree phase difference just by playing with the settings on your system. Now, machines like this one, they fix phasing issues by giving you a delay setting for the channels in case your mics are picking up different, the same thing at different distances. So you can, if you got a phasing issue, you can set up a delay here, and I'll show you just really quick what that is. Now, for this part of the demonstration, I'm just going to mess with the overhead channels here. I'm not going to screw around with the snare track or the kick track. It's just going to be the overheads. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go into the channel display, and since this one was the closest mic, this is the mic that's going to pick up the sound first. This mic was a couple inches farther away, so it would pick up the sound second. Not a whole hell of a lot, but a little bit. So up here in the view channel for the AW4416, we have a delay setting. This will allow us to set a delay on any channel we choose, which we're currently set to monitor channel 1, and it will allow us to change things and see if they need to be brought back in phase, or if they're coming in a little bit too late compared to the other channel we have running. And if you can hear, I have a train going by my house right now. We're just going to be messing with the delay on channel 1 here. Now, as you can see, as I increase that out from a 0 millisecond delay as high as a 9.2 delay, we heard the two sides become more and more separated. But initially, that's not the case. Let's go all the way back to, well, to the very beginning with a 0 delay. And we're just going to change it just minutely while we hear the sticks click, because that's going to give us the best idea of how it's working. Go back to 0. Let's go back to the 1.7. Now you can, I don't know if you were able to tell that well, but if you're wearing headphones, I can definitely tell. I'm starting to hear the image pull apart. Now, but as we keep moving, now you can start hearing it separate more and more. Now, I don't know about you guys, but to me, that sounded like as I went from a 0 millisecond delay, where the sound appeared to be coming maybe 9-10 o'clock out of the headphones, and pulled it closer and closer to a 1 millisecond delay, the sound seemed to become a little more centered. Now, hopefully you were able to hear, if you were wearing headphones or whatever system you were listening on, that when the delay was set at 0 milliseconds, the clicks on the stick sounded like they would be coming at about maybe 9 to 10 o'clock if you were listening through a set of headphones. They'd be coming a little bit over here. And as I pulled it closer and closer to the 1 millisecond, it almost sounded like it was coming into phase, coming this way. And then as it got even closer to the 1 millisecond, then I started noticing it was starting to pull apart like this. And I'd start hearing a phase variance that gave it a stereo image. So the idea is that if you are slightly out of phase because your mic positioning is not equal distant from whatever source you're recording, in this case the snare, well then in the case like the machine like this that has a channel delay function on it, you can use that to fix any phasing issues pretty damn well. And then if it's really bad, like if you do actually have major difference between when you pick up one side and you hear it in the other side, then you can use the delay as the actual delay and make it so that both sides come through at the same time. So it's no longer ping-ponging from one side to the other. Well, hopefully that'll give you some bit of insight into Glyn Johns technique, how well it works for more modern heavy metal, hard rock music, and give you an idea of just what reversing the phase on some channels can actually do to help drastically improve the sound of the mix. Anyway, I'm Brian, this is Inside the Studio, and thank you for watching. Good night.
See me reflected in the mirror.